There's something interesting I've been noticing when it comes to Neverness to Everness lately. Every time this game comes up, there are always a few reactions that show up almost immediately. Some people say it just looks like another Genshin or Wuthering Waves clone, just with a different coat of paint. Others say that they're not really interested in the modern setting, that it feels less exciting compared to the more traditional fantasy worlds we usually get in gacha games. And to some extent, I can understand where those reactions are coming from. On the surface, it does look familiar. It has that open world structure, the character-based system, the kind of presentation we've already seen before. So it's easy to look at it and think, I've seen this already. But I think that's also where the biggest misunderstanding comes from. When people look at Neverness to Everness, they're mostly judging it based on what it looks like, instead of what kind of world it's actually trying to build, and those two things are not the same. What this game is setting up is something we don't really see that often in this genre. It's not just another fantasy world, and it's not just another post-apocalyptic setting. It's something much more grounded, but at the same time much more flexible. It's a modern world where the supernatural exists alongside everyday life, and that might not sound that exciting at first, but from a storytelling perspective, that kind of setting has a very different kind of potential compared to what we're used to. The kind of stories you can tell in a world like this are not the same as the ones you tell in a typical gacha game. They can be more personal, more grounded, and in some cases even more impactful precisely because they are closer to something we can actually relate to. So instead of looking at Neverness to Everness as just another open world gacha, I think it's much more interesting to ask a different question. What kind of stories can this world actually tell? And more importantly, can it do something that most gacha games struggle to do? Because if it can, then this might end up being one of the most interesting settings we've seen in a long time. So before we go any further, I want to start with the main criticism that keeps coming up whenever people talk about Neverness to Everness, and that is the idea that it just looks like another generic open world gacha game, that it feels like a copy of Genshin or Wuthering Waves or any other game in that same space. And like I said earlier, I don't understand where that reaction comes from. If you look at it purely on a surface level, it does follow a lot of the same structure. It has the open world, the character-based system, the exploration, the kind of presentation that we've already seen before, so naturally the first instinct is to group it together with everything else that looks familiar. But the problem is that this comparison stops at the surface. It focuses on how the game looks and how it plays structurally, but it completely ignores what actually matters when it comes to storytelling, which is the world that the game is building and the kind of stories it allows. That's where Neverness to Everness starts to separate itself. Most gacha games, even when they look different, tend to operate within very similar types of worlds. They either go for high fantasy, post-apocalyptic settings, or large-scale sci-fi, and because of that, the kind of stories they tell also end up following similar patterns. You usually have some kind of world-ending threat, a large overreaching conflict, and a structure that is built around constantly escalating stakes. And there is nothing wrong with that, it works, and it works very well. But it also means that a lot of these games end up feeling similar, not because they are copying each other directly, but because they are working within the same kind of narrative framework. Neverness to Everness, at least from what we've seen so far, is trying to do something different. Instead of building a world that is entirely defined by large-scale conflict, it builds a world that feels much closer to reality, a modern setting where everyday life still exists, but where something is clearly not quite right. And that difference might not seem that big at first, but it completely changes what the story can do. When your world is grounded, when it feels familiar, the focus naturally shifts. It's no longer just about saving the world, it becomes about how that world affects the people living in it. It becomes about smaller, more personal stories, about characters dealing with things that feel closer to home, even when those things are tied to something supernatural, and that is something that most gacha games don't really explore as much. So when people say that Neverness to Everness looks generic, I think what they're really reacting to is the structure, not the substance. They're seeing something familiar on the outside, and assuming that everything underneath is going to be the same, but when you actually look at the kind of world it's setting up, and what that world allows from a storytelling perspective, it starts to become clear that it's not trying to do the same thing at all. And that's why I think this is one of those cases where first impressions can be a bit misleading. Because the more interesting part of this game is not what it looks like, it's what it can potentially become. Once you move past that initial impression, I think this is where Neverness to Everness actually becomes far more interesting than it first appears. The world it is setting up is fundamentally different from what most gacha games tend to rely on, and that difference goes much deeper than just aesthetics or setting. Most gacha stories are built around a very specific structure, one that focuses heavily on escalation, where the narrative starts with a relatively contained problem and gradually expands into something much larger, eventually turning into a conflict that threatens the entire world. While this approach works very well for maintaining long-term engagement, it also comes with a trade-off that becomes much more noticeable over time. As the scale of the story keeps increasing, it becomes harder to keep things grounded on a personal level, and even though emotional moments are still present, they often end up competing with the constant need to raise the stakes, which can sometimes make characters feel like they exist to serve the plot rather than the story being shaped around them. A setting like Neverness to Everness operates on a very different kind of foundation. Instead of relying entirely on that constant escalation, it builds a world that feels much closer to reality, a modern environment where everyday life still exists, but where something clearly feels out of place. And that constant alone changes the way the story can function. When a world feels familiar, even to a small degree, every supernatural element introduced into it carries a different kind of weight. It doesn't just blend into the environment as another expected part of the setting, but instead feels like something that disrupted, something that stands out in a way that immediately creates tension. That tension is not just about large-scale conflict, but about the way that disruption affects the people living in that world, and this is where the storytelling potential really starts to open up. The narrative is no longer limited to asking how a threat can be stopped, but can instead explore how that threat changes the lives of those who are forced to live alongside it. This allows for a much wider range of storytelling, where the focus can shift naturally between larger, more impactful events and smaller, more personal moments, without one constantly overshadowing the other. That flexibility is something that many gacha games struggle to achieve because of how heavily they rely on scale to maintain interest. What makes this even more important is the way those smaller grounded moments contribute to the larger narrative. When a story takes the time to build its characters and relationships in a setting that feels believable, any major shift in tone or escalation in conflict carries significantly more impact, not because it is bigger, but because it feels like something meaningful is being disrupted. In that sense, a world like this doesn't lack excitement, it simply approaches it differently, relying less on constant escalation and more on contrast, atmosphere, and character-driven storytelling, which, if handled correctly, can lead to moments that feel far more impactful than what we usually see in this genre. This is why Neverness to Everness has the potential to stand out, because it is working within a framework that allows for a different balance, one where the story doesn't have to constantly chase bigger stakes to remain engaging, but can instead build its impact through the way its world and characters interact over time. Now, as much potential as this kind of setting has, there's also a very real risks that comes with it, and I think it's important to talk about that as well, because this is not that kind of world that automatically makes a story better just by existing. In fact, if it's not handled properly, it can very easily end up doing the exact opposite. The biggest issue is that a grounded setting like this doesn't have the same safety net that more traditional gacha stories do. When you rely on large-scale conflicts and constant escalation, it's much easier to keep the player engaged even if some parts of the writing are weaker. There is always something happening, always a bigger threat on the horizon, always a sense of urgency that pushes the story forward. Here, that doesn't exist in the same way, and that means the story has to carry itself differently. If the characters are not strong enough, if the relationships don't feel natural, or if the world itself doesn't feel alive, then everything starts to fall apart much faster, because there is nothing else to compensate for it. A grounded story without strong character writing doesn't feel immersive, it just feels slow. And I think this is where a lot of people's concerns are actually coming from, even if they don't phrase it this way. When they say that the setting feels boring or that it doesn't look interesting, what they might really be reacting to is the fear that nothing meaningful is going to happen in that world, that is going to rely too much on being grounded without actually using that to build something engaging. There's also the risk of the story not committing fully to its own strengths. One of the easiest mistakes to make with a setting like this is to fall back into the same patterns that other gacha games use, where everything eventually shifts back into large-scale conflicts, without properly building the foundation that makes those moments impactful. If that happens, then the setting loses what made it unique in the first place. And on the other side, if it leans too much into slower everyday storytelling without enough progression or direction, then it risks losing momentum entirely, especially in a live service format where players expect the story to keep evolving over time. So there's a balance that needs to be maintained here, and it's not an easy one. The story needs to take advantage of the grounded setting to build strong characters and meaningful relationships, but at the same time it also needs to know when to push forward, when to escalate, and when to deliver those big moments that give everything weight. If it fails to find that balance, then all that potential we talked about earlier doesn't really matter. So while I do think Neverness to Everness has a very strong foundation from a storytelling perspective, it's also the kind of foundation that demands a lot more from the writing. It's not something that can rely on structure alone. It has to be carried by execution, and that's really where the uncertainty comes from. Not whether the setting is interesting, but whether the story will actually use it properly. This is exactly why, despite all the risk we just talked about, I still think Neverness to Everness has one of the strongest storytelling foundations we've seen in gacha games in a long time. If there's one area where this kind of world can truly stand out, it's in how interactive it can become. Most gacha games treat their worlds as a backdrop for the story, something that exists mainly to support the main narrative, but rarely feels like it actively participates in it. You move through it, you experience it, but very rarely you feel like the world itself is reacting to what is happening. Here, that has the potential to change. When your setting is grounded, when it resembles something closer to reality, it opens the door for a different kind of immersion. One where the world doesn't just exist around the characters, but becomes part of the storytelling itself. Environmental storytelling becomes much more meaningful in a space like this, because small details can carry a lot more weight. The way a place looks, the way people behave, the subtle changes in the environment, all of these things can tell a story without needing to explicitly spell it out. That's something we don't really see explored deeply in this genre. At the same time, character storytelling also gains a different kind of strength. When the world feels much more interactive, the characters within it feel more connected to it. They don't just exist to move the plot forward, they exist as part of that world, shaped by it, reacting to it, and influencing it in return in a more natural way. When those interactions are done right, it creates a much stronger sense of presence, where relationships don't feel isolated to specific story moments, but instead feel like they are continuously evolving within the world itself. This is where Neverness to Everness could do something that most gacha games struggle with, not just telling a story, but making you feel like you are inside one. If the world responds even in small ways, if it reflects the events that are happening, if characters feel like they exist beyond just the scenes they appear in, then suddenly the story doesn't feel like a sequence of events anymore. It feels like something that is constantly unfolding around you, and that's a very different experience. One that relies less on big isolated moments and more on consistency, atmosphere, and the accumulation of small details that build into something larger over time. Of course, all of this depends entirely on execution. None of this is guaranteed, but the important part is that the potential is there, and it's the kind of potential we don't really see often in gacha games, because most of them are not built around this kind of interaction between world, character, and story. So when I look at Neverness to Everness, I don't really see a game that is trying to copy what already works. I see a game that has the opportunity to approach storytelling from a slightly different angle. One that, if done right, could make its world feel much more alive, more connected, and ultimately, much more impactful than what we're used to. And that's why, at least for me, this is not just another gacha to keep an eye on. It's one of the few that genuinely feels like it could do something different. That's why I'm so interested in seeing where Neverness to Everness goes from here. Not because it looks revolutionary on the surface, and not because it's trying to completely reinvent the genre, but because it feels like it's building something a little different underneath, something that, if handled properly, could lead to a very different kind of storytelling experience. At the same time, I also understand why a lot of people are still skeptical. This is the kind of game that will live or die entirely based on execution. The potential is clearly there, but whether or not it actually reaches that potential is a completely different question. And I think that's what makes it interesting. So I'm really curious to hear what you think about it. Do you feel like this kind of setting actually has more potential than people give it credit for, or do you think it's going to fall into the same patterns we've already seen before? If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, it really helps the channel more than you might think. And if you want to see more videos where we break down stories and worlds in game like this, then subscribing is always appreciated. With that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.